So that way the other classes can see it if they didn't get a chance to. Okay, so you have the renal pelvis. Right here, these are your minor calyces. So each individual one underneath the nephron is going to be a minor calyx. And where those minor calyces join together, you get a major calyx. Okay? So at the end of the pyramid, you have a minor one. And again, that's going to be collecting urine. Two minors join together to make the major. And then when the major calyces come together, they form into the renal pelvis. Okay, so now we can look at our nephron. So this middle portion right here, this is your nephron. Your kidney has thousands, millions of these, all filtering urine. That's what they're working to do. So the nephron has several components to it. It has what's called the renal corpuscle. How do I want to describe this? So your renal corpuscle are these little bulbous things, these little balls that you see right along here. And it's this as well. So this is a renal corpuscle. It's just kind of blown up in this case. So they took one of these little ones and they expanded it. So you have a renal corpuscle. The renal corpuscle is all of these structures that you're seeing. It is the glomerulus. Glomerulus is just a specific name for the capillaries in the nephron. So these right here are your glomerular capillaries. Okay? So blood is going to come in through this artery. That artery will split into capillaries because filtration happens at capillary beds, right? Filtration doesn't happen at arteries, it happens at capillary beds. It just happens that this capillary bed has a specific name called the glomerulus. So blood comes in through this afferent arteriole, that's what it's specifically called, is the afferent arteriole. It splits into your glomerular capillaries, and then it leaves the corpuscle through the efferent arteriole. So these are both arteries, afferent arriving, efferent exiting. Okay, the afferent arteriole is a lot bigger than the efferent. That is going to make sure the pressure in the glomerular capillaries stays high, because you have a larger artery entering, so you're going to have a higher blood flow coming in than you are going out. So that's going to make sure that the pressure in the capillaries stays high enough to filter blood, right, to filter out water and solutes. The podocytes. So podocytes are cells around the glomerular capillaries. So if you look at your glomerular capillary bed, you see that it has little silver dots and kind of cream colored cells. That's what those are. Those little silver dots are cell bodies of your podocytes. And the podocytes wrap around the glomerular capillaries. And if you look at yours, you can see little red lines in between each of the podocytes. And those are the filtration slits. So blood is going to come in through the afferent arteriole. It'll split through the glomerular capillaries. And because the pressure is high in the glomerular capillaries, it's going to force out water and solutes through those filtration slits between the podocytes. Okay, any questions so far? Feeling all right? The podocytes, the filtration slits, the fenestrations and pores, those are those tiny, tiny little holes that you can see in the capillaries that don't have the podocytes wrapped around them. Those are just for little small filtration of molecules. We did the afferent in efferent arterioles, afferent arriving and efferent exiting. Okay, so here's where we start to get a little specific. The renal corpuscle is both the capillaries and the capsule that are being held in. That's your renal corpuscle. The capillaries just themselves are the glomerular capillaries, however you want to say it. The capsule just by itself is the glomerular capsule, or Bowman's capsule. So you can talk about the capsule as Bowman capsule, you can talk about the glomerular capillaries, or you can talk about both of them being the corpuscle, the renal corpuscle. So it's just kind of looking at how things can be put together and how they break down the organization. So when you hear these terms, you understand when we say renal corpuscle, we're talking about the whole thing. When we talk just about the capsule, it means just the capsule. Okay, the Juxtaglomerular Apparatus and the macula densa cells of the distal convoluted tubule. So these are both for maintaining proper filtration rate in the kidneys and solute concentrations, sodium and water concentrations in the body. The Juxtaglomerular Apparatus, those are going to be in the afferent arteriole. So see how you can kind of see those cells in the afferent arteriole? Those are what we call your JGA cells, Juxtaglomerular Apparatus, JGA. Those are those little cells there. And then in this kind of greenish looking tubule, mine's kind of green, I don't know if it's just faded or not, that's the distal convoluted tubule. We'll talk about that in a minute. But this is your distal convoluted tubule. It has cells as well. And the cells in the distal convoluted tubule, the macula densa cells, and the JGA cells in the afferent arteriole, they communicate with each other to help regulate urine formation and blood filtration. Whoops. The tubule system. Okay, so that was the nephron, the renal capsule. Let's look at the tubule system of the nephron. So again, blood is going to come in through these arteries. It gets filtered through the glomerular capillaries and into this capsular space. So blood is getting filtered, and in this capsular space you have water and solutes, just different types. It's going to go out through this tube right here. This part is the proximal convoluted tubule. We call this the PCT, the proximal convoluted tubule. If you look at your little kind of diagram right here, so you can again see just the nephron, let's say we start at this one. I'm going to start right at this one because you can kind of see the glomerular capillaries, and there's a little tube that's coming off of the capsule, and that's this proximal convoluted tube. And you can see how it's kind of windy and bendy. So proximal convoluted, meaning that it's proximal to the beginning of the capsule. Okay? After the proximal convoluted tubule, you go into what's called the loop of Henle. It's this loopy pit. It's very descriptive. So you have the descending limb that's going down deeper into the kidney. Because again, if you just take this and put it right here, you can see that as you go down this limb, you're going deeper into the medulla. So the descending limb and then the ascending limb. That gets a lot of people because they have trouble tracking which one's ascending, which one's descending. Descending limb comes after the proximal convoluted tubule. And the ascending limb, and then you have the distal convoluted tubule. And again, it's distal, not in location, because you can see this distal convoluted tubule is right next to the capsule, but it's further along in the tubule system. So the proximal convoluted, descending limb, ascending limb, distal convoluted tubule. Then you start to have your collecting tubule. No, what do we call it? Where is it? Doesn't have it on this one. It's it is the collecting tubule, and then in the collecting tubule are these little ones that you can see, these little kind of nicks that are coming off of this larger singular collecting duct. So you have multiple collecting tubules draining into one collecting duct. And again, each one of these tubules is going to be coming from its own little nephron, right? Its own little glomerular capsule tubule system. This collecting tubule will drain down into a minor calyx. Two of those minor calyces will join together to make a major calyx. The major calyces join together into the renal pelvis. That drains out the kidney through the ureter. And you have urine. Actually, you have urine before that. You have urine as soon as it gets into the collecting tubule. That's when we start calling it urine. That's an important thing you'll have to know for your lab. Okay, any questions? That was like a quick overview. If you have not started the urinary system stuff yet, which you shouldn't because it's not until next week, that probably is a lot to try and remember, and it might not stick yet. So that's why we have a video, so you can watch it later.
I have a question.
Yes, please.
The renal tubule,
Mm-hmm.
is that the one that comes out of the corpuscle?
Renal corpuscle, renal tubule. Yes, yeah, the renal tubule system is the renal tubule is the proximal convoluted tubule, the loop of Henle, the distal convoluted tubule, the collecting tube, and the collecting duct.
Okay.
All
The
of it.
tube that directly comes out of it, that's the proximal?
That's the proximal.
Okay.
And then, yeah, you have your renal corpuscle. What did we say are the components of the renal corpuscle, the two components?
The two minor ones, like a major.
Nope. This is the corpuscle. So it's the capsule. So we call it the renal capsule because, you know, who's bound? We don't we have to name it after him. The renal capsule and the glomerulus, which are the capillaries. So you have your renal corpuscle and your renal tubule. When you add those together, that makes your nephron. Your lab tries to do it by kind of having the nephron there at the top and then all of these parts to it. But I think it's easy to see like that. And your book does have a really good image description of this. I'll figure out which one it is. It's in the lecture for sure, but it does a good job of breaking down all the different components of the nephron, the corpuscle, the tubule, and their individual things. Hey. Yeah, so did that answer your
Yes.
question, Sandra? Cool. Cool.
Thank you.
Yeah. Any other questions though about that first step?
Is this the lab or is it okay? Like, if I wanna come and just by the number?
No,
Oh, yeah?
no, sorry. The libraries are open if you want to come on campus, but the labs are not. Yeah, you can take a picture of it. And I mean, it should be the same as the pictures on page 87 and 88.
Oh, it's the same.
Yeah. Okay, so luckily I've been recording this so you can watch it later, time. Yes.
Awesome.
Thank you.
Okay, let's look at some of these pelvic models. This sounds good. If you want to grab any of these, you're welcome to get some too. I'm getting male and female urogenital models, one of the torso models, because these are helpful. Yeah. Ooh, there's a good one. Okay, so as I said, your kidneys filter blood to make urine. That urine drains through the ureters into the bladder. You have two kidneys, you have two ureters. They both empty into one bladder. Okay. Yeah, these ureters are usually yellowish kind of tubes. You can see them there. You can see them coming from here, these kind of palish colored tubes coming out of the kidneys on this side. They all go down into this bladder. So this is fairly low. This is going to be right about there. So your bladder, if you have a cat, then you probably know exactly where your bladder is. But your bladder is fairly low down in your abdomen. It's not up higher down here. It's very much lower down in your abdomen. When you feel the urge to urinate, you should go urinate. If you let urine sit in your bladder, it causes more destruction of those cells. It increases your chances for infection and bladder cancer. So when you get that first signal, as long as it's an appropriate place, go to the bathroom. The urinary bladder has smooth muscle. It's called the Detrusor muscle. If you take out one of these little bladders, you open it up, you can see this ring of muscular tissue on the inside. So it's kind of like the stomach. It's going crisscrossing all different ways. So collectively, it's several layers, but collectively we refer to it as the Detrusor muscle. It's smooth muscle innervated through the autonomic nervous system. Within the Detrusor, or within the bladder rather, there is this, so this is the upper portion, this is the inferior portion of the bladder. There's this smoothed out little bit, and again, you can see it on page 80, or on page 90, there's a picture of this bladder. And it's D that I'm talking about right now. That's the trigone. Nope, you were there, just there, Francine. Turn it. Yep, nope, right there at the top. Yeah. So that little smooth bit in the bottom of the bladder, that's called the trigone. And this is where urine sits. It's smooth, and the urine just sits right in the trigone. So that typically is the place of infection and cancerous cells where they're going to be located because urine collects right there. What else are we doing? The rugae are the folds on the inside of the bladder. Those will allow it to expand even more. The stomach also has rugae, these folds. The neck of the bladder is this constricted portion just at the kind of where the trigone is leaving the bladder. That little constricted bit is the neck of the bladder. On the picture, I think it's an E, or maybe it's a G, I don't know. Yes, that little bit there.
What is it?
The neck, that's the neck. The ureteric orifices. So ureteric refers to the ureters. Okay? Don't get that confused with urethra. So ureters come from you have two ureters coming from your kidneys to the bladder. You have one urethra leaving your bladder, taking urine out of the body. So the ureteric orifices are on the inside of the bladder, and they're essentially these little spots on the trigone. They're small little holes on the inside of the trigone, and those are the ureteric orifices, because an orifice is a hole. So that's where the ureters enter into the bladder and deposit their urine. Those small little holes on the either top side of the trigone. Mm-hmm. That little one right there. Yep. Okay, so if I were to give you this bladder, just give you this one right here, you should be able to tell me if that is a male or a female bladder. Which one is this? This is the inferior, this is superior. This is a male bladder, but I appreciate the guess. So you can always tell it's a male bladder. It has the prostate underneath it. Okay, so that's the prostate. So again, in the male, you have the bladder, and then just underneath that has the prostate. It secretes its own fluid that gets mixed for semen. And what else we have to do? Yeah. So whenever you look at the bladder, if it has a prostate, we'll identify it as a male. We'll stick with male. Let me get this off of here. Okay, so here is the inside, kind of a section of the male reproductive system. Again, there's plenty right on the table if you want to get your own. Or you can look on your lab manual. It's on there. Page 89? Yeah. Okay. So in the male urethra has 3 sections to it. It's still one continuous tube, but it has 3 different portions to it. You have the prostatic, the membranous, and the spongy. The prostatic urethra runs through the prostate. So you can see on top you have the bladder. Just below the bladder, you have the prostate. So that little section of the urethra that runs through the prostate is the prostatic urethra. Then you have the spongy urethra. It's small. It is just really this section right here below the prostate, just that small little bit. And then you have, I'm sorry, that's the membranous, my fault. You have the prostatic, and then you have the membranous, and then you have the spongy, which runs the length of the penis, of the shaft. That's the spongy urethra. And the spongy urethra ends at the external urethral orifice, which is, again, external, so outside, urethral, not ureter, urethral, orifice being the hole of the opening, where urine exits the body. So males will have the prostate, 3 sections to their urethra. The female urethra, the male urethra is for both urine and semen, so it has both a urinary and reproductive function to it. The female urethra is just for urinary purposes. Let's open this one up. Sounds good. So when you do the female cross-section, you have the uterus on top, the bladder right underneath it. And then you have the urethra leading out of the bladder through the external urethral orifice. It is the most anterior opening. Posterior to that, you have the vagina, and then most posterior, you have the rectum. Yeah, and this is pretty straightforward because it's all just, like I said, it's just the urethra, it's just for urine. Once we get into the reproductive system, that's when the female system starts competing with the male for complexity. But yeah, that's pretty much the urinary system structures. Any ones that you want me to go back over or look back over? No? Okay. We are going to do a little chart. So now we're going to actually get into urinary filtration and how urine is made. Again, you haven't done this chapter yet. It's not until next week, so I don't expect you to know any of this, and if it seems overwhelming, hopefully after you watch the lecture video and do the notes, it won't be as bad. But now that you kind of understand the general structure, let's see how this goes. All right. So how I'm going to start mine out is we're starting by drawing the tubule system. So we're going to pretend that the glomerulus and the filtration is happening right here. And we're going to start right after that. So we're going to start with the proximal convoluted tubule, the loop of Henle, the distal convoluted tubule, collecting duct. Okay? Just so you see those. So you have your proximal convoluted tubule, the descending limb, the ascending limb, the distal convoluted tubule. This section right here is the collecting tubule, and then this whole thing is the collecting duct. So that last little bit from the distal convoluted tubule to where it joins into the collecting duct, that's the collecting tubule. So the tubule system is the permeability changes as it goes through. So it's going to be more and less permeable to certain ions, to water, and other certain components. The proximal convoluted tubule, this is the site of most reabsorption. So you have blood being filtered right here, and then that fluid that gets formed immediately goes into the proximal convoluted tubule. So it kind of makes sense that you would want to start reabsorbing all the things that you need to keep right away. Before it can get too much further down the system, as soon as fluid comes into the proximal convoluted tubule, you want to start reabsorbing any glucose that you might need, any sodium that you might be needing. So the things that we're going to be reabsorbing like I said, glucose, any proteins, any small proteins that might get filtered. There really shouldn't be very many proteins in your urine. Same thing with glucose, there should be no glucose in your urine, or very, very small amounts, if any. Sodium is reabsorbed here. 65% of sodium that is taken back up is taken back up in DCT. 65% of the sodium excreted is usually taken back. Water, again, 65% here. Water is going to follow sodium. That's a principle of just nature, that as sodium moves somewhere, water follows it. That has to do with hypertonic and hypotonic solutions. So as ions moves, water just wants to redistribute that balance. So you have all of these things starting to be reabsorbed. We're not done yet. There's several more. I'm gonna just move to the side. You have potassium, phosphate, PO4, and bicarbonate. So again, when your blood was initially filtered in the glomerulus, you had all of these excess things that get filtered as well, because it's non-selective. It's just based off of pressures and charges, so it just kind of pushes everything out. The higher that filtration rate is, so the higher your blood pressure is, if it's consistently high for long periods of time, you're gonna have increased rates of filtration. You're gonna have more proteins in your blood, more glucose in your blood, or in your urine rather, because your filtration rate is higher. That pressure is higher, so it can push more out. So at your proximal convoluted tubule, it has a lot of microvilli. It has tons and tons of microvilli on its cells to aid in that reabsorption, kind of like the small intestine does. The small intestine reabsorbs a lot. The proximal convoluted tubule is going to work to reabsorb a lot of these essential nutrients that we need to keep. Our body wants, the whole point, and again, this is a good big picture lesson, the whole point of the urinary system is to concentrate urine as much as it can, to retain and hold on to as many nutrients as our body needs while excreting waste and excreting any excess water that might need to be released. That's why when you go urinate, your urine should not be a dark yellow. You want your urine to be pale yellow, almost clear, and should not have much of an odor to it. If your urine is dark yellow and has an odor to it, you're probably dehydrated, you need to drink more water. At least first. Lots of other things that can cause that, but generally. Okay, so any questions about just that proximal convoluted tubule doing a lot of reabsorption? After we move there, we start to go into this loop of Henle. And the loop of Henle is where we really start working to concentrate our urine. And it does that by having varying permeabilities for water and sodium. So the descending limb is permeable to water, and it's impermeable to sodium. Impermeable to sodium. Meaning that as fluid moves down the descending limb, water is going to be going out of it, but sodium will get stuck in. So your fluid in the descending limb, as you go down and down, gets more and more concentrated. So by the time that you get down to the end of the descending limb, that's kind of peak of the loop, that's when your fluid is going to be the most concentrated. It's still not urine yet. We don't call it urine yet. Remember, it's not urine until the collecting tubule. So it's still tubular fluid at this point. So at the end of the descending limb, your tubular fluid is as concentrated as it can be because you have all this water moving out, but all the sodium is still stuck in. Now, as we go up the ascending limb, this permeability flips, and it becomes permeable to sodium and impermeable to water. So now you have this really, really concentrated fluid. Your sodium can now move out, so the sodium will start to move out of it. But you've already gotten out as much water as you can, so it's already very concentrated in there. And that's what your body wants. It wants to try and hold onto as much water as it can. Because just outside of this, so like, here's our little tube and everything, just on either side of this is that interstitial fluid, just where our lymphatic system will start to drain more fluids, so any excess water can be reabsorbed and returned to circulation. So this fluid in the actual tubule system itself can be concentrated over and over again. Okay, now we get into the distal convoluted tubule and the collecting tubule. This is when things we start doing what's called regulated reabsorption and secretion. So at this point, it was just basically, let's take it all back. As much as we can, let's just do some transport from the tubule fluid back into our bloodstream. Then we concentrated that fluid. And then we get into this last portion, and this is where it starts to fine tune it. This is when you start getting other signals, hormonal signals and neural signals from the rest of the body that say, you know what, we need a little more bicarbonate. We need a little bit more sodium now. Our blood pressure is starting to drop a little bit. So down here is where we have our regulated reabsorption. Okay, I'm just gonna write it off to the side. Your sodium, so you still have more sodium being reabsorbed. It is regulated by regulated reabsorption by aldosterone and ANP. Do y'all remember those hormones? Maybe? We'll do a refresher. You'll do a refresher. Water. It's only going to be in the collecting tubule and collecting duct, so not in the distal convoluted tubule, but regulated reabsorption in collecting tubule, collecting duct, by aldosterone and ADH. Potassium in the collecting tubule. You have specific cells. Your type A intercalated cells reabsorb continuously. And the principal cells vary secretion based on the levels, based on concentration levels. I'm sorry, based on aldosterone. So for potassium, it is going to be regulated through the collecting tubule via the type A intercalated cells. We'll see there are type A and type B intercalated cells. And your principal cells. Type A cells are constantly reabsorbing potassium. Okay. I'm gonna have to move here. We're just gonna make this a little smaller. Duct. There we go. Okay, so for calcium, PTH, parathyroid hormone, stimulates reabsorption. In the distal convoluted tubule. Bicarbonate, we have more bicarbonate. Bicarbonate is a buffer for the blood, so it helps make sure the pH state is maintained. It's, again, regulated by blood pH, so not a hormone release, but an actual physiologic level. Type B cells secrete your bicarb. So instead of the type A intercalated, your type B intercalated, you're going to secrete bicarb. And we have hydrogen. So your bicarbonate is going to be your buffer. Your hydrogen will make it more acidic. The type A cells and B cells work here. Type A and type B. Type A excrete hydrogen, and type B absorb it. The last one is urea. Urea. 50% of urea is reabsorbed / recycled.
Regulated by,
regulated by pH.
okay.
Yep, your pH. pH of the blood, not pH of the urine. So this is going to be signals from outside of the kidney that say, oh, the pH is too acidic or the pH is too basic of the bloodstream, not of the urine or the fluid. And yeah, urea is one of those, it is a waste product, but to be able to properly concentrate urine, we have to have at least 50% of the urea that we produce be reabsorbed by the body. So one of my favorite things, and you know, I've taught yoga for 10 years, so people always talk about, oh, you know, detoxing and doing a detox and going and sweating out all your toxins. You do not sweat out toxins. If you are sweating toxins, you need to go to a doctor immediately. Something is wrong with you. And even still, it's always that funny thing. It's like, no matter how much you're sweating out, your body's still gonna keep 50% of your urea. It has to be able to properly concentrate your urine. So this idea that like we need to completely get rid of our toxins, some of the waste products are healthy. And you know, also urea isn't a toxin, so it's different in that sense. Okay, that's the first side of my page. Again, if this is like, okay, I'm just writing down words, I'm not really understanding it yet, that's okay. At least you wrote down the words, you got the video, you can watch it later. All right, I'm gonna erase this. Is that okay? I'm gonna start at this end, because we have another side. But are you starting to at least understand, okay, with hearing this and going through this, does it kind of, you're putting the urinary system together, hopefully at least. The big picture. So I mentioned some cells. Let's get to those. We're going to look at the cells and the hormones. So the cells. You have two main types of cells in your tubule system. You have the principal cells. These are going to be in the distal convoluted tubule, collecting tubule, and collecting duct. They typically respond to ADH and aldosterone. And we saw they're working with potassium and a little bit of sodium to regulate nutrient absorption. The intercalated cells, these are in same places, distal convoluted tubule, collecting tubule, collecting duct. They regulate urine and blood pH. Not urine, blood pH. Two types. Your type A, eliminate hydrogen. Type B, have two roles. They eliminate bicarbonate and reabsorb hydrogen. So if your blood pH started getting, let's say your blood pH was like 7.5, normal is 7.35 to 7.45, and even a change to 7.5 would cause your body to react. Which cells would be active if your blood goes to 7.5?
Type B.
Type B. Yep, because that means that your blood is getting too alkaline, and so it needs to eliminate bicarbonate and start reabsorbing more hydrogen to bring it back down to that 3.5 to 4.5 level. Okay? Hormones, regulating the urinary system. We have A and P. It is going to increase our GFR, which is your glomerular filtration rate. Remember, the capillaries that filter blood are called the glomerular capillaries. The rate at which they filter blood, that blood is filtered through the capillaries, is called your GFR. So ANP, atrial natriuretic peptide, increases your GFR. Does that increase or decrease your urine formation?
Increase.
Increases it, yep. So remember, A and P is released because when the heart starts to stretch too much, the atria release A and P, and that triggers the kidneys to increase urine output. The kidneys make more urine by increasing the GFR, by increasing how much stuff is getting filtered out, really how much fluid is getting filtered out at the capillaries and the kidneys. To lower blood pressure, as well as decrease sodium reabsorption. That's decreased sodium reabsorption. This last bit is pretty important because the less sodium, so as you increase your GFR, again, it's going to increase the rate of fluid filtration in your capillaries. So that means that there's going to, as blood comes in, you're gonna have more fluid filling up in this capsular space, going down through the tubule system. It's not only, when you increase GFR, you don't only just increase the rate of filtration here, it affects the whole system, the whole tubule system. So if the fluid is moving faster through the tubule system, do you think that increases or decreases reabsorption?
Decreases.
It decreases, yeah, decreases. and see, they're on top of it, they're smart. It decreases reabsorption because the faster molecules move, the faster fluid moves, the less absorption and exchange you have. That's true in any capillary bed. When your blood pressure is higher, when your total blood pressure is higher, you have less filtration happening in the beds potentially because the fluid is moving faster. In your lungs, the air has to move, and the blood has to move, the blood has to move very, very slowly across the alveoli, so that way you can have that gas exchange. Same thing here in the kidneys. The fluid in the tubule system has to move, at a slow enough rate that the molecules can actually be reabsorbed. It's kind of like, like fishing in a river. It's a really high velocity river. You can't really snatch fish out of there, but if it's really slow and you can kind of see them, you can grab them a little bit easier. So if you increase GFR, you're going to increase your urine formation, but you also decrease reabsorption of any nutrients. So you'll have more, it's not just sodium, you're going to have more glucose, more proteins, more everything in your urine. But of course, as we decrease our sodium reabsorption, as sodium stays in that tubular fluid, that's going to make water want to stay in the tubular fluid as well, right? Because water follows sodium. So if sodium isn't being reabsorbed, water's not going to want to move out as much either. So that's another way that it decreases blood volume and blood pressure. The next is just a little response to stretch of atria. We know it's stimulus. Overall, reduces blood volume, increases urine output. The next one, aldosterone. Increases sodium reabsorption in principal cells. That's supposed to be increases sodium reabsorption and increases potassium secretion. And we'll say aldosterone stimulus is increased potassium concentrations. Increased potassium concentration. If you have increased sodium reabsorption, what does that do to your blood volume and your urine output? Increased sodium reabsorption into the bloodstream, what will water do? It'll follow it, yep. So if you increase sodium reabsorption, you're increasing your water reabsorption. And what does that do to blood pressure? Increases blood pressure, yep. So remember, back in cardiovascular system, aldosterone increases our blood pressure. Here's how it does it. There's a reason we start with chapter 17. Okay, ADH. Anti-diuretic hormone. It's coming from the posterior pituitary gland. It will bind principal cells to increase aquaporin transporters. We're just going to say aquaporin transporters. That's fine. This will decrease water loss. And just another little note from practice plotting. ADH is directly involved in urine concentration. So our principal cells, these are going to be, again, towards the end in the distal convoluted tubule, collecting tubule, and collecting duct. As ADH is released from the posterior pituitary gland, it will bind to those principal cells and it will increase the synthesis of aquaporin transporters. Water can move out in between cells, it can usually diffuse into cells, but there are aquaporin transporters that actively will move or will make it easier for water to move and be reabsorbed. So the more aquaporins you have, the more water transport you're going to have. So ADH concentrates direct involvement in urine concentration by increasing the number of aquaporins, which decreases your water loss. Okay. And that's what I had for urine, the urinary system. This is, by far not all of it, but these are the things that usually trip me up. Where are things being reabsorbed and regulated reabsorption? What are the cells? What are the hormones? Okay, any questions? I'm going to go back real quick. If y'all want to take a few minutes break, you can. I'm going to go back and just talk about those bits that I did not record earlier. Just make sure they get on video. Okay. So that means you can actually, you won't get to miss anything today. You get to get it all. So looking at just these original structures. The first thing is the kidney. So that is, this whole thing is the kidney. You have two kidneys. It is covered by this renal capsule, this fibrous renal capsule. Going into the kidney, you have the renal artery that's bringing blood. And you have the renal vein that drains the filtered blood from the blood that's been filtered from the kidney. You also have a ureter. So three vessels, the renal artery, the renal vein, and a ureter. Those all go into or out of the kidney through what's called the hilum. So the kidney, again, is a completely enclosed structure, but you have vessels going into and out of it, and they have to go in and out through something. And that something is called a hilum. Your kidneys have it, your lungs have it, your lymph nodes have them. It's just a passageway that makes sure that these vessels aren't exposing the organ or the structure to the outside and the rest of the body. So it just is the hilum is just a passage that these vessels travel through. Again, you have the renal artery bringing blood because the kidneys filter blood. They filter blood and make urine. Once the renal artery goes in, it splits and splits. And if you look at page 84, number 2, it has all the different segments of how your arteries or how your vessels are going to split. Once that blood has split and gone into the nephrons and been filtered, it will join back in through the renal vein where it gets returned. The outer portion of the kidney is called the cortex. So we've seen that before, pretty much all structures. The outer portion is the cortex. The inner portion is the medulla. The middle is the medulla. The renal columns are these projections of the cortex in between the pyramids. So you can kind of see how there's little projections of the cortex that move down into the medulla. And those are the renal columns. The pyramids are these kind of fan-shaped objects. The collecting ducts, you can see you have one kind of major collecting duct. This is a collecting duct. They have multiple collecting tubules that drain into one collecting duct. This duct, so this portion right here is just kind of the same as this right here. And so you can see this collecting duct is going to drain into a minor calyx. So each of these collecting ducts drains into minor calyces. Minor calyces will join together to make a major calyx. And then when the major calyces come together, they form the renal pelvis, which is where urine is stored until it leaves through the ureter. I think everything else was up to date.